Judges Corner is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com and gatheringmagic.com. Support our show by visiting both websites. Now it's time for Judges Corner with David Green.
Hi, and welcome back to Judges Corner. Today we have a very special topic, but before we do that, as you can see, things are a little bit different. We're at a different location at Cool Stuff Games Maitland's storefront, and with me is my co-host Ricardo. So, Ricardo, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, David. I'm a level 1 judge from the sunny state of Florida. I've been doing judging for about a year now, and most of my events I work with David. So when he asked me to come on the show with him, I said, sure, let's go ahead and get this done.
So why, you may be asking, would we need 2 hosts? That's because today's topic is Two-Headed Giant. And what better way to talk about Two-Headed Giant than in a team? So if you had to describe Two-Headed Giant to a brand new player or a player who's never played it before, how would you do that?
The best way to describe Two-Headed Giant, it's a lot of fun. It's a death match between 2 teams of 2 players each. And life totals and poison counters work a little different. Life totals go up to 30 starting out, and the poison counters go up to 15 instead of 10. And pretty much it's from there on how you want to kill your opponent. And, from there it's deck construction's a little bit different, and we'd be more than happy to go ahead and go over that today.
So speaking of that, what is the difference between deck construction with Two-Headed Giant and other formats? Well, deck construction with Two-Headed Giant varies based on what format you're playing. For example, in Limited, the teams share a card pool of what they open, and they build 2 decks out of that. In constructed formats, such as Standard or Modern, you have a unified deck construction rule, which means that your deck and my teammate's deck need to be put together as one, and they need to be one continuous legal deck, which means I can't have any more than 4 copies of one single card between the 2 decks that we're playing. So 4 lightning bolts, not 8. Another thing is the ban list. The ban list for the format that's being played applies to Two-Headed Giant, in addition to a special ban list just for Two-Headed Giant. Currently, though, that ban list only has 1 card on it, Areo Soratami Ascendant. Also, the primary player is the player who sits to the right, and the primary player is the player who makes any decisions in the event of a dispute between teammates, where one player would normally make a choice and the 2 can't decide on something.
Now, before we get started with the phases and everything like that, we're going to go ahead and touch base on how the game will start. Now, you would decide first on who goes first. If you go first, you don't draw first. After that, you always decide mulligans. If you mulligan, you go back up to 7, then down to 6, then down to 5, then 4, then 3, then 2, then 1. You always get a freebie.
So let's talk about something about Two-Headed Giant life totals. Sarah Avatar would use the team's life total instead of just one player. Anything that would set players' life totals to a specific number, such as Biorhythm, would instead use 1 player on the team. That player would be the one officially affected by it, and then the team's life total would be set to that number. And any loss of life, damage, or gaining of life happens to the individual players, and it affects the team's life total afterwards. For example, I have a Kingpin's Pet, and I play a Walking Corpse. When I do this, I can extort it. I'd like to mention that my teammate can't extort off of my spells because he didn't cast the spell, so the spell's not going to trigger for him. So, when I play my spell and I pay for the extort, each of my opponents are going to lose 1 life. And because they each individually lose 1 life, because they're each of my opponents, they're going to lose 2, and it causes me to gain 2 off of the extort trigger. And when that happens, I'll individually gain 2, but me and my teammate's life total will increase by 2 life.
Alright, so you said that we could go ahead and share our life totals, fair, but what are some things that we can't share?
That's a good question. Some things that we can't share would be like the cards in our hands. I can't pass you a card over and hope that you use it well. I also can't share mana in my pool. I can't produce so much mana and float some over your way so that you can use it to cast your spells. So speaking of some things that we can and can't share, let's talk about the things that we can and can't do as a team.
Alright, so things that you can do. You can look at each other's hands. You can look at hidden zones that one teammate has access to. For example, you get slaughter games, you target whatever, and you look at your opponent's library. Your teammate has access to looking at their library as well. Another thing is discussing strategy, so long as it doesn't slow down the game.
Speaking of some things that you can do, the can'ts would include, you cannot write notes to each other in order to communicate. This is because it's too difficult to distinguish if the notes were created before the match began, or if the notes were created while the match was taking place. In addition to that, you cannot touch or manipulate your teammates' cards. And finally, you can't enter a Two-Headed Giant event by yourself. So, going through the rest of our turn, we do take our turn steps and phases together. So we'll draw at the exact same time, we'll untap at the exact same time, we'll enter our main phases in combat at the exact same time. We can't really rush ahead of each other. I can't start attacking before he's ready to start attacking as well, and vice versa. And speaking of steps or phases, let's look at some cool examples. So first we have Temple Mastery, and I'm getting an extra turn. But what happens? Do I get an extra turn? Do I get to choose my teammate to get an extra turn, or do we both take an extra turn altogether? Fortunately, whenever there are any extra turns, steps, or phases, or loss of turns, steps, or phases, the entire team suffers or reaps that benefit. Another example of that would be Aurelia. Both my partner and I get the extra combat phase and can attack once again. And finally, Mindslaver, or Soren's ultimate, which controls an opposing player, actually controls the opposing team. So that's pretty epic if I do say so.
So you refers to the controller of the spell, not the team. So examples of that would be Chroma's Memorial. All of your creatures get all of those benefits. Your teammates, however, don't. And another card, Safe Passage, you might want to make sure you reread it before you cast it, because it only prevents combat damage that would be dealt to you. So if David gets attacked, sucks. If I get attacked, sweet.
So another thing worth covering would be when triggered abilities trigger at the beginning of steps or phases. They'll trigger once every single time we hit those steps or phases, unless they trigger for each player or each opponent, in which case they'll trigger twice because there's 2 players going through that step or phase. So let's look at some examples to help clarify that. So in a first simple example, let's take a look at a werewolf. Here we see that it has a triggered ability that says at the beginning of each upkeep. Even if there's 2 players in the game on the same team going through that upkeep, it'll only trigger once because it only triggers at the beginning of the upkeep, regardless of how many players are in the game. At another example, we have Havoc Festival, which triggers at the beginning of each player's upkeep. That trigger will go on the stack twice because there's 2 players passing through that upkeep. And if we look at that exact example, we'll see that in a two-headed giant game from 30 life, 1 player will end up losing 15 life and the team's total will go down by 15, and then another player will end up losing 8 life and the team's total will go down to 7 from there.
Alright, so we've gone pretty much over most of the turn, but the one crucial part that we haven't gone over yet is combat. It does work a little different with two-headed giant. I'm going to go ahead and let David explain that part.
It doesn't work that different. Well, there are some differences. We attack as a team, you guys block as a team. We go through everything that seems like it would be pretty normal, but there are a few distinct differences. Like in our first example, what if I have something out that says, you can't attack me, can you attack him? Well, let's see how that works. So earlier we mentioned how the word you refers to an individual player. But what happens if a card refers to you in terms of preventing an attack coming to you? In situations like this, you will actually prevent the attack from happening to the entire team. In such an example as Sphere of Safety. This card can't allow creatures to attack you or planeswalkers you control, and that extends to your teammate as well, because that basically means they can't attack your team or planeswalkers your team controls. In this example, in order for them to attack my team, they have to pay X equal to the number of enchantments I control for each attacking creature. And just to clarify, it's equal to the number of enchantments I control, not my team. So, what happens if we look a little deeper, when damage is actually being assigned? Well, in Two-Headed Giant, when you get down to dealing damage, you pick one of the 2 players for each creature to have its damage be assigned to. Ultimately, it's going to affect the team's life total, but it is important for things like Safe Passage, where you could actually send the damage at the player who wasn't protected by Safe Passage. With a big creature as our first major example, Balefire Dragon deals damage to each creature the opponent controls equal to the amount of damage that player took. So, does the entire team's creatures take all of that damage? Or do one of the 2 players take it? Or how about none? Well, when we get down to dealing damage, we'll assign damage to one of the 2 players, and that particular player will have the trigger affect them, and all of the damage will be dealt to their creatures as well.
Now, once you've gotten combat done, game's getting close to over, what happens? How does the game end? Well, it ends the same way that any other game would end. 1 player loses, 1 player wins. However, now it's 1 team win, 1 team loses. So if David here were to get door to nothingness, or if I were to cast some spell or something that makes him lose his entire library, or he just flat out quits. He says, I'm done, I don't want to play anymore today. Game over. That's where the game ends. So from there, it's pretty much how you lose, and then after that, there's certain precautions that take place.
So congratulations, the game is finished. What do we do now?
Well, now that the game's over, you can go hang out with your friends, you can go to the concession stands, you can go get something to eat, you can go over to the vendors, you can go do all of that other stuff.
Whoa, we only played 1 game.
Right. You only get to play 1 game. There's no sideboards. It's best of 1. There's nothing else after the first game.
Okay, and another thing worth talking about would be what happens if we do draw in between the time that the first game started and before the round is ended, naturally. Well, if we draw naturally, well, we continue playing. We shuffle up and try to get into another game if there's still time on the clock. But then the next question comes up, what happens if time runs out?
Well, if time runs out, then you proceed as normally, but instead of the average of 5 turns that you'll take, you only take 3. Because there's a lot that goes on between turns, and we have to make sure that the tournament goes at a reasonable pace.
So, I think that basically covers the majority of Two-Headed Giant. Stay tuned next week for whatever else we have planned, and until next time, shuffle thoroughly,
play at a reasonable pace, and have fun.